And please take your seats. Those of you that are filing in the back, please close the door as we're supposed to be started about 3 minutes ago. We're up on audio? Okay. Audio is now up. Just a reminder, all of these lectures will be available online following the class. Last week, we covered a brief history of Yugoslavia, as well as a background of the Soviet system and the rise of General Secretary Romanov in the setting leading up to the 1986 European War. Additionally, we discussed the European stages for that conflict. If you missed this introductory class, please keep in mind that mandatory attendance was taken. And if you may have been dropped by the registrar, make sure you visit them prior to continuing on here. Today we'll be discussing America in the 1980s and segmenting on to the early phases of the Yugoslav intervention and the 1986 war more broadly. In 1980, the United States was coming out of a period known as the Malaise of the 1970s. This was categorized by the oil crisis, a situation brought on by OPEC, the conglomeration and cabal of oil-producing states that sought to drive up international oil prices and bring about shortages in the United States. This was damaging to the economy under one-term President Carter. And prior to this, we'd seen the Watergate crisis, the single term of President Gerald Ford, and a constant revolving door of government leadership and low government trust among the American people. Additionally, in the early and mid-1970s, we saw the end of the Vietnam War and a deepening distrust of both institutions at large, but also rampant civil unrest coupled with the tail end of the civil rights movement. Violent crime rates in the United States at this time were nearly 50% higher than they are today, and it was characterized as one of the most domestically untranquil periods in American history. In 1980, after seeking a second term in office, President Carter had been defeated by incumbent Ronald Reagan. The country at that point was set on a course of rearmament and economic revitalization under Reagan, who brought in a new both measure of charisma but also a certain conservative charm that he had developed as the Republican governor of California. Reagan was often seen as a radical and a warmonger at the time, and Soviet leadership leading up to and including Secretary Romanov were horrified when this movie star became president of the United States. They saw it as an unprecedented thing, but for us today, with a reality star in the White House, we no longer see this as that unprecedented, but you have to imagine at this time the only types of men that had ever inhabited the White House were men steeped in economic and government institutions, sometimes business, most typically the federal government, occasionally a governor or two like Carter before him. But Reagan had set the course of the country on a more conservative tilt and structured a rebuilding of the American military and its economic engine following the malaise of the 1970s. Reagan was substantively tested in his first term following the bombings of a Marine barracks in Beirut, and then the Grenadian intervention in 1983, which will be covered in Professor Cresswell's class on America in the Long 20th Century. Short to say here, these were early stages of America's revitalization of the military. 3 years into a Reagan term, you had not really seen these efforts bear full fruit, but the United States was again becoming ambitious, flexing its might on the world stage and reiterating its deep distrust and hatred of communism and its steadfast opposition to its spreading into the Western Hemisphere. In 1984, Reagan wins a second term in office, and we see here one of his most famous campaign ads, the Morning in America clip. Can we have that?
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And Under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
So now we have set the stage for the United States in this period. Coming out of mourning in America, the economy is on the rebound from the 1970s and some of the difficulties still present in the early 80s. By early March of 1986, we're seeing intervention of Soviet forces, as we discussed previously, into Yugoslavia. President Reagan is secure in his second term and is moving forward with steadfast support in the legislative branch at this time. Originally, the early Soviet campaign could be regarded as a lightning one, consisting predominantly of motorized and mechanized rifle elements, helicopter troops, with some light armor support. The bulk of Soviet armor forces remained at their posts along the Iron Curtain during the early intervention into Yugoslavia, and was followed up during this intervention by a speech from Secretary Romanov calling upon these forces to make the land safe once again for socialism. It was unclear at the time, from an outsider's perspective, if the goal of this intervention was to restore Yugoslavia as a whole, or if it was to set up satellite states that were all under the Soviet socialist sphere. So either we're restoring a pan-Slavic nation, or we are setting up a catch of smaller sub-nations or ethnic nationality nations, but all one way or the other under the Soviet sphere. Now, historical records following the fall of the Soviet Union show us that the original goal as set out by the Politburo was to set up a collection of puppet states with a much enlarged Serbia to serve as a first among equals in that arrangement. Serbia had reached out to the Kremlin previously, seeking support, and they had been, or would have been, the Soviets had their way, been rewarded with a relative status of first among equals. When Soviet forces entered the Yugoslav territory, they did so across the frontiers of both Hungary and Romania. Bulgaria, to the south, was not included in the intervention plan, as it was felt that this would bring forces far too close to NATO-aligned Greece. NATO had readmitted Greece in 1980 following a short departure of that nation, but the Bulgarian frontier would later be crossed by Warpact forces, though they were not placed in Bulgaria nor crossing the border this early in the intervention campaign. To the north, major elements of the Yugoslav National Army, the JNA, aggressively resisted the Soviet advance, but due to a lack of coordinated JNA air cover and central command, the Soviets were able to overwhelm and destroy a majority of JNA elements, some of which were more heavily armored and equipped than local Soviet forces, which, as I mentioned, were predominantly characterized by motorized or mechanized rifle elements, helicopter troops with some light armor support, and through superior coordination and tactics, they were able to overwhelm and break apart superiorly equipped, in certain occasions, JNA elements. The largest engagement of the early campaign was the Battle of Somme, a major rail and infrastructure hub in then northern Yugoslavia. This involved major elements of the JNA and Soviet invasion front that resulted in approximately 20,000 casualties over the course of a 3-day exterior and then urban street battle that erupted around Somme. While the JNA did originally stop cold the Soviet advance for a good 2 days, which is rather unprecedented in the Cold War period, it was the last major coordinated action of the JNA, whose forces were routed after Soviet strategic bombers were brought into the region and carpet-bombed JNA positions. Many of those 20,000 casualties were also within the civilian population of Somme and were documented in Western media that was commenting on it at the time, and is also thought to be one of the major reasons that the United States and NATO forces took a harder tack against the Soviet intervention, following images of Soviet bombers flying low over Somme, dropping cluster and high explosive munitions. Following this engagement, Serbian militia and self-defense units quickly sided with Soviet invaders, while Croatian and Slovenian units attempted to defend their respective home territories and sided with NATO forces that began to cross the frontiers from Italy as the war escalated in mid-March. Airborne elements, in coordination with marine elements, hit the Croatian and Montenegrin coasts from NATO and began to push interiorly to secure additional territories before the Warsaw Pact was able to set up a majority of its control. It should be noted that the JNA, or what elements were left of it, did not offer substantive resistance against the NATO intervention, though they were often disarmed and regarded as potentially hostile whenever encountered by NATO forces, and sometimes firefights did break out as NATO forces were advancing both from the Italian frontier and also from the coasts. Recently declassified records that were pulled during recent research now shows us that the first clash between Soviet and NATO forces occurred in the skies over Yugoslavia as early as March 11th, when a formation of American F-15 aircraft intercepted and downed Soviet MiG-29s, while those F-15s were escorting elements of the 82nd Airborne Division to conduct night drops on Montenegro to secure areas in advance of follow-on NATO troops. Ground forces met for the first time around March 14th in the mountain village of Kolisin in north-central Montenegro, that saw direct interactions between NATO and Soviet forces. These were light forward NATO elements of the U.S. military that were quickly driven back by the 90th Guards tank division that was in the area, pushing south towards the coast and towards the key ports and strategic junctions that were there, especially the Montenegrin capital of Titograd, now, and I always typically butcher this, Podgorica. The NATO elements, when driven back, fell back to join follow-on elements that began to form a front line, and following March 14th, we see consistent clashes between NATO and between Soviet Warpact forces. However, the media narrative at this point was heavily suppressed on both sides of the Iron Curtain. We often see know of a great deal of evidence of Soviet interference with their media. However, embedded journalists were forbidden during the early stages of the Montenegrin and Yugoslav campaigns on the NATO side, and we see repeatedly that statements by both the White House and the Kremlin that under no circumstances had their forces met one another, engaged one another, and were only engaged, respectively, with JNA elements and radical local militias that had stockpiled or access to stockpiles of JNA arms. And while such formations did exist, Soviet and NATO forces clashed repeatedly throughout late March and into early April, though in no overwhelmingly massive elements. At best, we see battalion-level engagements leading into early April. The White House was known to have raised the United States defense condition to level 3 on March 18th, after it was understood that they had come into full and direct contact with Warpact forces, though this did not change until much later in the conflict. This is a heightened state of readiness, though not one that was uncharacteristic for such a hot period, and had last been seen during the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The White House, followed by several member states, consistently denied that NATO troops had engaged Warpact forces, even up until April 9th, when a very shaky video footage was released through the BBC that showed elements of the British Coldstream Guards manning checkpoints in Croatia, coming under direct fire from Soviet vehicles that were clearly marked, following them approaching their positions, deploying troops, and exchanging fire before the video cuts off. These continued denials began to undermine trust in the Reagan government, and statements from the Soviet government cut off at this period as well. Large-scale fighting would continue to be denied by both sides, and mail was being censored from troops headed home, and most news outlet organizations, as I mentioned, were forbidden from having embedded troops, and their correspondence were curtailed and kept in either port or general embarkation areas by NATO command. The war, however, took a very substantive change in tack, starting at about 1:30 a.m. on April the 26th, when in north-central Ukraine, the Chernobyl nuclear power station suffered a catastrophic emergency in one of its reactors, causing the entire reactor vessel to explode, and the vessel contents therein began to actually physically burn, which sent several tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere, killed dozens of technicians at the site, and would eventually kill several hundred first responders and within hours of the explosion. This crisis was further compounded by the fact that very, very few emergency military or helicopter assets were closely available to respond to this disaster, as most had been reallocated to the Yugoslavian crisis, were deployed in Europe, and were still engaged in the devolving conflict in Afghanistan in Central Asia. By the time local authorities in Chernobyl were able to gain control of the disaster, a massive amount of radioactive material had been released, spread across Ukraine and Central Europe, and was continuing to spread into the airspace of NATO countries. Due to a lack of coordinated response and the ability of the Soviet local command and political apparatus to evacuate the nearby town of Pripyat, it is understood that at least 19,400 approximately people received lethal doses of radiation and would die in the weeks and months ahead following this disaster. Due to a lack of fuel for trucks, again being diverted to war zones like Yugoslavia, it would take almost 5 days to fully evacuate the citizens of Pripyat, by which time approximately 5,000 would have already died from radiation exposure, and an additional 10 to 12,000 would die in the months and weeks ahead from acute radiation poisoning. The explosion and the radioactive cloud produced from the Chernobyl incident cut across central Ukraine, killing hundreds more, and ended up shutting down nearly all rail and road traffic across the Ukrainian Socialist Republic and creating a virtual radioactive dead zone in the middle of the country that folks were forced to be evacuated from, but also you could not transit through due to high levels of radiation and the omnipresent particulate matter that could not be easily cleaned, and contaminating anything that traveled through the area. This effectively cut off the supply of troops, equipment, and additional resources to the Yugoslav conflict. The situation was made even more severe by the need of the Soviet government to pull a majority of their aircraft and helicopter assets back from the conflict in Yugoslavia to address the ongoing disaster in Ukraine, to support recovery and emergency management efforts, what they could put together, but also to attempt to defend the Soviet homeland until the crisis was fully acknowledged. Originally beginning on the morning of April 26th, it was not until April 29th that the Soviets acknowledged the crisis, when General Secretary Romanov addressed both the nation and the world on live television and radio, something that he had been prone to do, and directly blamed the tragedy on the work of American saboteurs, called out specifically that the Reagan administration had planned this incident. We know now that this was a prepared response, that there existed no evidence whatsoever of American intervention. And during this speech, Romanov vowed extreme and swift vengeance both for the disaster and for the fatalities that followed. This followed a week of escalated combat in Yugoslavia, and both nations brought their nuclear forces at this time to the highest possible state of readiness in response to both the disaster and to Secretary General Romanov's comments. In hindsight, the culmination we now understand of the crisis came on May 5th, when in the early morning hours, a sentry walking his post at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, following these escalations, saw a man attempting to climb a fence at the base perimeter. The Air Force security officer then sounded a sabotage alarm, believing that the base was under attack by Soviet infiltrators, causing a coordinated response both at the base, but also strategic bombers across the United States were called to scramble, fully loaded with nuclear ordnance, believing that Soviet saboteurs would be infiltrating their bases as well, and could have precipitated a series of events that may have led to full nuclear engagement between the two respective countries. Thankfully, Within about 10 to 15 minutes of the initial report, it was determined by the Air Force that, in fact, a bear had attempted to climb the fence and had been shot and wounded by the watchful sentry, and that the scrambled bombers began to return to their bases. But this, not broadcast whatsoever in the press at the time, but can be regarded as the high water mark of nuclear tensions during the period. In the next class, we'll be discussing the NATO Titograd offensive, the continuation of the Yugoslav conflict, and how it eventually would spread into the general 1986 European War, and serve as the final public acknowledgement that NATO and Warsaw Pact forces were openly engaged with one another in the collapsed body of Yugoslavia. For those of you that are submitting your essays today, please place them up here by the lectern. Those will be graded approximately within the next week or so. Those that have rewrites from last session can produce them forward, and I will go to you. Finally, my office hours have changed. They will be on Tuesdays in the Molokan building from 2 to 4:30. If you are unable to make that time, please email me and we can make a separate appointment. Is anyone... All right, are we all set on the audio? Wonderful. Let's try to start cutting.